Welcome back. I'm glad you could join me again. I'm Professor John Blakeman from the UW-Stevens Point Political Science Department, and this is my ongoing lecture series on the U.S. Constitution, sponsored by the UWSP Alumni Association and their Alumni College Experience. And so this is lecture number 3, what I call constitutional politics and constitutional interpretation. And this should give you hopefully a broad overview on some of the classic ways we argue about the meaning of the Constitution. That's something that we will cover in lecture 4 as well. And it's also an introduction to what I call constitutional politics, which is our ongoing give and take about what the Constitution means and how it applies. Now, the book I'm reading, sort of a shameless plug, but if you're interested in reading a lot more about the founding era of the Constitution and reading the writings of Federalists like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, or even anti-Federalists, about 25 years ago, the Library of America released a 2-volume set called The Debate on the Constitution, and I would highly recommend it. Okay, let's get underway. Constitutional politics, and understand I'm trained as a social scientist, and so I tend to approach constitutional law not only from a legal standpoint but also from a political standpoint, simply because the Constitution guides our public policy, and as we will see, our basic political institutions often have differing interpretations of the Constitution. And so when I talk about constitutional politics, what I mean is, in part, the Constitution is a political document. It creates our national political system. And it emerged from a very political meeting, the Constitutional Convention, which, as scholars have noted, the Constitutional Convention was a bundle of compromises. It was a series of compromises between delegates from the 13 original states, well, actually 12 original states, because one state did not bother to send a delegation. But they didn't always agree on what the Constitution outcome should be. And so they had to compromise on many different things. Now, the Constitution itself is silent about who should interpret it and how it should be interpreted. Now, later on, we will come across a very famous case, Marbury versus Madison, 1803, which I bet you've heard of Marbury. That's where the Supreme Court declares that it has the power of judicial review. It has the power to interpret the Constitution and tell us what it means. And it's been that way for over 200 years. But the document itself is silent about who should interpret the Constitution and how, the method of interpretation. And so that leads to a lot of political debate. It leads to ongoing political, legal, and constitutional debates over what the Constitution means. And that's just a fact of American political life. Some people like that, other people hate it. But the fact is, as we'll see, any political era, there's going to be sometimes very profound disagreement over what the Constitution means. Now, who interprets the Constitution? Well, Marbury versus Madison tells us that it's federal judges and the U.S. Supreme Court especially, since the Constitution is a fundamental law, and judges, the role of judges in our constitutional system is to interpret the law. And there are 2 concepts here worth mentioning. One is judicial review, and judicial review is simply the power of a court to review a law as to whether it's constitutional or not. Now, at the federal level, federal courts exercise judicial review frequently. They frequently review federal laws for their constitutionality. They can also review state laws for their constitutionality. Judicial review exists at the state level as well. Every state has a Supreme Court, and every state Supreme Court will exercise some type of judicial review over state law, sometimes even federal law. Judicial supremacy is a different concept. This is the argument that When it comes to interpret the Constitution, judges are supreme, and especially the U.S. Supreme Court. And judicial supremacy means that the U.S. Supreme Court has the final say on what the Constitution means. Now, that's controversial. You make up your own minds, to be sure. But over 200 years of political experience, we've pretty much accommodated ourselves to the idea of judicial supremacy, that the Supreme Court has the final say. There are a couple of exceptions where we have amended the Constitution to overturn a Supreme Court decision on the Constitution, but that's very, very rare. There's another concept to think about here too, what we call coordinate construction. And we have to remember that the judiciary, Congress, and the executive branch are co-equal. In our constitutional system, they are meant to be equal to each other. Now, you know, one branch may have a check or balance over the power of another branch of government. Absolutely. That's what the separation of powers is. That's what checks and balances means. But the separation of powers also means that each of the three branches is equal to the other two. And of course, that means when it comes time to interpret the Constitution, judges interpret the Constitution. Hey, members of Congress do as well. Congress as an institution interprets the Constitution. The executive branch always has to interpret the Constitution. And we are often caught up in conflicts over, well, whose interpretation matters the most? And sometimes that's a really hard question to figure out. Now, other things to think about. Who interprets the Constitution? Well, judges do, Congress does, the presidency does, executive agencies do. So not only the president, the White House, or the executive office, but the IRS, which is an agency, has to interpret the Constitution from time to time. Health and Human Services has to interpret the Constitution. The Agriculture Department has to interpret the Constitution. It's not so noticeable in the public's eye, generally speaking, but executive agencies have to figure out what the document means, what constitutional principles are important and guiding when they implement public policy. Interest groups interpret the Constitution. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, very focused on the free speech clause, freedom of expression. The NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, has litigated a lot of 14th Amendment discrimination, equal protection cases. The National Rifle Association has litigated a lot of Second Amendment cases. Interest groups really matter. And our constitutional politics are sometimes driven by how interest groups view constitutional interpretation as well. Don't forget the states. We've got 50 states, several territories. States litigate, states interpret the federal Constitution as it applies to them. And then there's us, we the people. We have to interpret the Constitution as well. We have to figure out on our own what we think the document means. Now, of course, we should rely on judges, we should rely on Congress, we should rely on presidents, interest groups, yes, state governments, yes, but at the end of the day, we also have to engage in this process, and that's fine. We should argue with each other about what the Constitution means. We should do so peacefully, absolutely, respectfully, but yeah, we should focus on how we interpret the document as well. And then others, I don't know. You know, foreign governments who diplomatically engage with the United States, they have to think about what our Constitution means from time to time, especially when they are interacting with the U.S. State Department on a treaty issue, for example. So there are others I've left out, to be sure. But yeah, this might give you a different perspective. You know, so when it comes time to interpret the U.S. Constitution, it's not just the Supreme Court and judges. We do rely on them mostly, and that's fine. But all of these other institutions and agencies and actors have something to say as well.